on pathways to advance the adoption of renewable hydrogen and other renewable fuels, to support the integration of sort of variable energy sources onto the grid. He's recently completed a renewable hydrogen roadmap for the California Energy Commission, and he's a past chair of the California Hydrogen Business Council. He received his PhD degree in mechanical engineering from UC Berkeley and an MS in management from Stanford. So Jeff, I guess today you're going to tell us about how we're going to achieve self-sustaining hydrogen in California. Please take it away.
Yes, thank you very much. So first, let me confirm that you can hear me okay?
I can, yes. If there are any trouble, let us know on the chat, please.
Okay, very good. Thank you. So as Buzz said, I'll be presenting today a walkthrough on a project that we recently completed for the California Energy Commission. And first, I'd like to thank them for their sponsorship. And I'd also like to thank the organizers of this particular conference for inviting me to speak and putting on such a great virtual event. So before jumping into a walkthrough of our analysis, a little bit of context. So it's no surprise, and we've heard in many, many presentations that we have daunting challenges with climate globally. In certain locations, we also have daunting challenges with air emissions, and Southern California, where we are located, is one of those areas. Southern California hosts the only 2 extreme non-attainment districts under the Clean Air Act designations, which is the basically LA Basin and San Joaquin Valley. So for us, this companion set of challenges of conventional air emissions or pollution as well as climate are daunting. The California context is interesting in the sense that, you know, we're sort of not in the debate stage anymore. We have mandates in place for both greenhouse gas and air emissions. Firmly rooted in policy, but also in statute. So we have laws in the state that say it's not if you're going to do these things, it's how and when. The state logically is embracing an aggressive electrification strategy built on solar and wind. So we're fortunate in the state of California to have a very abundant solar resource, and we have pretty good wind energy too. We're not yet developing offshore wind, but we do have resource potential there too. So that's clearly going to be the dominant source of primary energy, but there are some issues to address on top of that that may be solvable in part through the use of hydrogen. So we don't look at hydrogen as an alternative to electrification. We look at it as a potential platform for an electrification strategy to address things that need portability of fuel, storage of large quantities of fuel, certain chemical and heat processes that aren't easy to deal with, and then seasonal storage we'll talk about too. So we'll be hitting a number of topics in common with the prior presentation, in some instances having perhaps a slightly different point of view that we can discuss. So a growing number of nations, and you saw some of these in the prior presentations, quite a few, it's like probably at least a dozen if you laid out European Union documents, individual nations within the EU, Japan, China, Korea, Australia, many nations, groups of nations, and international groups are beginning to articulate hydrogen strategies for, you know, how hydrogen fits into an overall future energy system. There's sort of a common point of around 20% of primary energy as being optimal for this, although this will evolve, you know, through its own, through competition. 20% was mentioned for the China strategy, but somewhere 10, 20%. So it's not thought to likely be the dominant supply, but one that will serve very important functions, in particular bridging sectors and addressing how to best use renewable electricity. So coming to our particular topic, narrowing down toward what we'll be talking about here, California is establishing fuel cell electric vehicle, attempting to establish a fuel cell electric vehicle market to augment other forms of zero emission transportation in the state. Fuel cell electric vehicles require fueling infrastructure similar in function and configuration to gasoline stations, right? So you need to have locations to fuel your vehicle. If those facilities are in place, hydrogen refueling has many things in common with the way we fuel conventional vehicles. It only takes about 5 minutes to fuel fuel cell vehicle. And so these are some of the reasons why we think consumers may wish to adopt them. But the state, recognizing that we need a network or a sparse network of stations for even the first buyer of a fuel cell vehicle to feel comfortable that they could fuel, given that they can't fuel at home as battery electric vehicles can. The state earmarked $200 million in funding for a network of up to 100 stations. So we're at 40 stations currently. We have 7,000 fuel cell electric vehicles on the road. But California does lack at this time a comprehensive cross-sectoral strategy for hydrogen. We definitely have one for most forms of electrification, and we have activity in hydrogen, but we don't yet have a comprehensive strategy in place. The transportation group within the California Energy Commission, who is overseeing and providing the funding for these stations, posed the question of what will it take for the hydrogen sector in California to become self-sustaining? So we've earmarked 200 million. How much more? You know, is it 2 billion, or, you know, how much do we have to put in? So that's in large part the topic we were addressing. Self-sustainability for the most part here means that the revenue generated within the sector and the capital financing for the sector would be provided without special subsidies. I will say, however, a carbon price isn't a special subsidy. So we do envision a long-term price for carbon in California, and it would apply on a level playing field to all technologies. And we'll get into that. And then, so we assessed in this roadmap effort the growth in demand for renewable hydrogen in the state, potentially for all uses, the progression of cost for producing and delivering renewable hydrogen, and then sort of taking those together and saying, what does a build out look like? How long does it take? How much does it cost? And what do we need in terms of policy and research to make it happen? The work was divided into pieces. So if I start on the right over here and say at the end of the day, we're trying to get a perspective, and this is scenario based because it's long-term and uncertain. But at the end of the day, you know, what does this fleet of renewable hydrogen production facilities look like in California? What technologies may play, and, you know, where might they be located? That has implications for planning. It has implications for disadvantaged community impacts and things like that. So with that, you know, then what does the state need to do to make this unfold successfully? So going a step to the left, feeding into that would be a forecast of the dispensed cost of renewable hydrogen. We looked at all applications, not just light duty vehicles, but the main thrust of the analysis was related to light duty vehicles. So when we say dispensed cost of hydrogen, that means at a hydrogen vehicle refueling station. So in addition to this cost progression, how does the demand build over time? And we did some assessments of land use, area requirements, proximity to infrastructure, and other requirements for different types of hydrogen production facilities. And then going into this cost analysis, there are several pieces. First is conversion technologies themselves. So gasification, electrolysis, and anaerobic digestion, all of which take feedstock and convert to hydrogen. So those conversion technologies are a substantial piece of the cost, generally capital intensive. But then we need feedstock into the process, depending on what type of process. So we need to know the cost and availability of feedstock, which is organics for several of the pathways, biomass of various types, but also wind and solar as feedstock for electrolysis. So it wasn't the focus of our work in this particular study, but we also had to bring in the cost from the hydrogen production plant through to the vehicle and how that will evolve. So we used a DOE model for that purpose. So this is the structure of our work. It's also to an extent the structure of the presentation. So we'll go through each of these building up. So first of all, what was in scope of our assessment relative to renewable hydrogen production? There are a lot of ways to produce renewable hydrogen. Conventional natural gas with carbon capture and sequestration could be considered a zero carbon pathway as well. We didn't include it in this analysis because the perspective of the sponsor was, you know, this is renewables and that's maybe zero carbon, but not renewable. So let's look at renewables with a capital R. So we looked at wet organic pathways, through anaerobic digestion, which yields methane. And so then we need to do reformation. Now there are existing steam methane reformation facilities, so those can be leveraged in the early market. And this is the pathway we see most in the early market. In fact, coming from landfills, not even purpose-built digesters. So the next will be thermochemical, so gasification or hydrothermal processing or similar pathways where you don't need to go to methane. You can, but you can go directly to hydrogen. And at least in principle, this is a pretty inexpensive pathway. Just a second, I'm starting my stopwatch late. Okay, so, and then electrolysis. Then also, I think we've heard in some of the talks, this photosynthetic or direct conversion of sunlight. That technology group is too immature to have explicitly included in this analysis. But across all the technologies that we looked at, anything that comes over the horizon that's new and better basically means that the cost outlook is better than what we're projecting. So cutting to the end, foreshadowing our finding, today in California, the pump price of hydrogen, and it's around 30 to 40% renewable, 60% conventional. It's about $16 at the pump. A kilogram energy-wise is equivalent to a gallon of gasoline. So it's, wow, that's kind of sticker shock. As a matter of fact, it's being subsidized basically by the auto manufacturers through a fuel allowance in the lease that you have. But everybody in the sector knows this won't cut it for very long. We have to get into a range of say $6 to $8, which if you compare that directly to a gallon of gasoline or diesel seems high. But a passenger fuel cell vehicle is 2.5 times more fuel efficient than a gasoline vehicle. So in the carbon credit program, but also in kind of the vehicle economics, you have this fuel efficiency. So we're sort of targeting a fuel economy adjusted parity with conventional fuels over the short term. Later on, out in the 2040 and 50, that's irrelevant. We're competing against electricity going into battery electric vehicles. This range of kind of $4 or $5 kilogram of hydrogen should be adequate to remain relatively cost competitive with electric drive. And at the end of the day, we may see a situation not dissimilar from today where certain vehicle classes are pure battery electric and that's it. And then maybe pickups, SUVs, larger sedans would either share the market with battery electric vehicles or maybe would be dominant in some sectors. I drive a Hyundai Nexo, which is a SUV, and it's fantastic. I've also owned a plug-in vehicle for my wife's 7-mile each-way commute. I use my fuel cell vehicle for my 75-mile each-way commute. So in our cost analysis, in order to determine how much does it cost to dispense hydrogen to a vehicle, we need to look at all steps in the value chain from feedstock through to the station itself. So we'll go through these steps of our cost analysis and start with production because that's the focus of our work. So forecasting these different technologies, we relied mostly on a pretty extensive secondary research effort, but we did learning curve analysis for every technology to compare. So we did our own learning curve analysis, but we looked at sources that included expert elicitation. So that can be a formal, type of process where they take great care in the order in which they ask questions. They decide how many experts they need and do it very rigorously. Then there's also the sort of small, less rigorous. We did 40 interviews for this work, which were not structured in that way. But so expert elicitation, progress or learning rate, bottom-up analyses. The DOE has developed a number of tools that allow different hydrogen technologies to be built bottom-up with a tool where you can take a look at different components, and then analogy or proxy analysis. So that would be like, we don't have a lot of well-validated learning curve data for biomass gasification, but we do for coal gasification. So you might say, okay, let's borrow our learning rate from that. We normalized all of our cost data to a common point in time and a common currency, and we established technology-specific facility size to normalize because, as you heard in the last presentation, they're scale sensitive, and I'll talk a little bit about that. So when using the learning rate, you have two things that really drive the prediction. Your learning rate, and your rate of market growth. So one form of this looks at a time-based, like how much cost reduction you have per decade or something. The underlying data shows that the more accurate approach, called Wright's law, is to look at cumulative global production of something and look at how costs evolve for each doubling of the global cumulative production. So we use this rate quite a bit. For electrolyzers in particular, like fuel cells, the learning rate is very well correlated. If you look at a scatter plot of, different sources on learning rate for electrolyzers is 18%, which is a pretty strong learning rate, plus minus 6%, and that may sound like a wide error band, but for learning rate, it's not. So that's close to this. 25% you rarely see, but this is what solar has done over decades, and wind in the low 20s. Bricks and mortar, big chemical systems like gasifiers are more prone to be 5 or 10, and sometimes they could even be negative if they have a lot of regulatory baggage like nuclear. So then, as was mentioned in the prior presentation, scale economies can be important. They're pretty flat for electrolyzers actually, because if you think about 500 kW up here, but we would view that you're starting in terms of legitimate commercial deployments in the 10 megawatt scale. So it's pretty flat scale wise for electrolyzers. The AD and gasification systems behave more like conventional chemical systems of like a 0.6 to 0.7 scale factor. So much more scale sensitive. We also looked at the systems and said, okay, what's a typical cost buildup, so that if we found a source that only looked at, say, stacks or system, we could include that in the data. So here's an example of the findings. And, as much as we tried to reduce the data for common scope, common currency, common point in time, common facility scale, there's a lot of scatter. One thing that's interesting to point out, though, is most of them show similar trajectories, even though at different points in time. So this blue is a study from 2014. It looks very similar to this study from 2017. And in fact, this one referred to this one. They're showing very similar progression. So what happened is there tends to be optimism on when the global market takeoff is going to occur. So with all these announcements of hydrogen strategies that I mentioned, it's looking a little bit more like the market, acceleration is upon us, but this group thought the same in 2015 and this one in 2017. That said, we are seeing more evidence that this is beginning to build. These are actual bids in the California market in 2018. So I think as a benchmark, these have a certain reality to them. But we're seeing also anecdotal evidence of larger order sizes already in like the $600 range. So a lot of what happens in the future will really depend on how fast the market builds. But what we have seen in the literature, but also in our interviews, that you can probably come down almost by a factor of 2 just moving from the current 100 megawatt scale annual market for electrolyzers up to a gigawatt or 10 gigawatts, because just through the factory layouts and configurations, you can get to a much more efficient production volume without fundamental technology improvement, which is also in the cards, right? But you get a lot just from the production efficiency. So if I aggregate all the different technologies, so we found that all of them will likely increase in their cost effectiveness to some degree. The anaerobic digesters and gasification systems less so, but to the extent we do see a significant build out, we will see some project repeat effect, supply chain effects, and others that bring them down. Electrolyzers definitely predict to be the most substantial cost reduction, declining probably well more than 50%, more like 60% improvement over time. So that's the conversion cost technology projections. So then the feedstock, oops, wrong way. So we looked at various sources. The Department of Energy has commissioned and published a study which has been updated at least once, referred to as the Billion Tons Study, where they look at all the biomass material in the US, its density and where it is and how much it would cost to recover it. That was our primary source. This visual shows you, and this is from the Cal Fire, but it's just because it's nicely color coded to show the different types of vegetation in different parts of the state. But we looked at a few sources and found, we bounded the quantities of available biomass based on those studies, 700 to 1200 petajoules if you care. So then for the electrolyzers, the feedstock, of course, is electricity. And for renewable hydrogen, it's renewable electricity. And like pretty much everybody else, we're seeing a continuing improvement in production costs from wind and solar. So I'd point out at this point, one thing that's often discussed relative to electrolytic hydrogen in particular is, well, it's for using surplus or curtailed or something renewable. Is true. My favorite price for renewable power is 0 or negative, but we don't need that for cost competitive renewable hydrogen. As a metric for electrolysis, you can take your dollars per your cents per kilowatt hour, divide by 2, and that's the energy component of your hydrogen cost. So 3-cent power is $1.5 per kilogram hydrogen. That doesn't include the capital component, but that's cost effective in my opinion. So kind of aggregating where we stand, we've got now feedstock and conversion costs. So what does it look like? Anaerobic digestion is pretty mature. It has less cost improvement potential. So you would say, okay, so that should be stricken from the remaining analysis. However, in California, we have mandates for the diversion of organic material from landfills. So meaning by say late 20s, I'm not sure when the exact compliance point is, but it won't be legal to dispose of any organic material in landfills. So energy conversion facilities will serve the role of landfills, and like landfills, they'll receive tipping fee. They'll be paid for taking the organic material. So the tipping fees change this economics on a net basis. We'll talk about that later. In terms of a pure head-to-head economics, you can see the thermochemical systems, the gasification systems project to be quite cost effective even today. They have some siting and financing reasons, but for me, looking at where they potentially can be economically, it's surprising we're not seeing more development. Electrolyzers, as you've seen in the prior presentation, currently are not that cost effective, but have the opportunity to really come down rather rapidly, and over the long term will probably be the low cost producers. Also, when we consider feedstock availability, ultimately the biomass pathways will be dealing with limits on feedstock quantity, where although obviously wind and solar in California are not unlimited, but the resource potential is so much larger than the need, we could consider them almost limitless. So the next question is, all right, you're maybe optimistically able to produce low pressure hydrogen at the plant gate at some cost, hopefully getting toward $2 in the reasonable near term. We now have to get that material from there through to the refueling station. So there's 2 primary methods for doing that being used in California today. One is compressed gas in tube trailers. The other is liquefied hydrogen in cryogenic tankers. The more recent stations are tending toward liquid because as fuel demand at the individual stations increases, storage in liquid form at the stations is going to become more optimal. But we see both in the supply chain and probably will continue to do so. Longer term, dedicated hydrogen pipelines and advanced hydrogen carriers like liquid organics and metal framework could come into play. We haven't explicitly included them or projected what will happen with them, but if they succeed in displacing these pathways, then that means they're cheaper and better. So that again reinforces the results. So we used a DOE tool called HDSAM, Hydrogen Delivery Scenario Analysis Model. And it has some of the same features that we talked about in the production facility forecasting, which is it considers the scale of the facility within the model. It considers its utilization, of course, this is capacity factor basically. And it considers the state of the market. So early market would be low cumulative global production, medium, and high, right? So that's kind of a proxy for learning effect. What we see is that the biggest impact is utilization of the network. It's currently a little less than 40. This is on purpose, right? The state put up money to put up 100 stations to give confidence to early adopters. As we get more and more adopters, then station utilization comes up and we start to build more stations. So by the 2025 timeframe, we make a pretty significant improvement in cost, driven mostly by station utilization, secondarily by evolution to larger station size, which gets you some scale economy and assumed continued growth and development of the market. So this, probably this utilization factor over the coming 5 years is maybe the most significant thing in the whole projection. So if we now take production costs, which we talked about, supply chain and dispensing costs, how does it look? So without, and this is without any carbon price. Oh yeah, 4 minutes. All right, a lot to go through still. Okay. So by 2030, the bottom line here is we're getting, without carbon credits, toward the basically the upper end of the range we need to get to. So that's the answer here. Now, we do have carbon credits in California. We expect to continue to have carbon credits. There's also a federal program. I don't know what's going to happen with that. Many of the hydrogen pathways qualify for that, but I'll focus on the California program, which is basically a carbon price on vehicle fuel. So this carbon regime in California is developed based on carbon intensity of the fuel. And basically you generate carbon credits based on the carbon intensity of your fuel versus the carbon intensity of a standard, which starts out as gasoline carbon intensity and ratchets down. Because the standard ratchets down, the value of your credits changes over time. So currently, if you had a zero CI pathway, it would be worth about $4 a kilogram. By 2050, it's going to be worth about $1. This is if the carbon intensity standards goes down to 20 from the reference of about 100. So it means basically you're running away from a lion or bear. You have to get your cost reduction down while the credit values decline so that your price doesn't come back up again. So I talked about tipping fees. I'm going to skip this for time, but the organic pathways receive a tipping fee, which will allow them, and that'll probably adjust itself to make that fuel competitive in the market. So this gets back to what I showed, and the last 20 slides are proof of this, I claim. So on the demand side, the prior presentation talked a lot about these sources of demand. The point being here that any current use of conventional hydrogen is a candidate for conversion to renewable hydrogen for decarbonization over time. A major source of demand for renewable hydrogen in particular is the growing and emerging population of light-duty fuel cell electric vehicles. These are some forecasts by the auto manufacturers. Projections are that by 2030, we could have a few 100,000 up to as many as 1 million fuel cell electric vehicles. Beyond the light-duty vehicles, we can serve all other forms of transportation. At the end of the day, those may even be, have larger shares of hydrogen use. Beyond on-road, marine, rail, even aviation. I didn't show the airplane because people are skeptical, but people are working on that. So we talk about the grid. For sake of time, I'm going to have to really reduce the focus on this, but I would say, as you heard in the prior presentation, yes, seasonal storage is predictable. The seasonal mismatch between supply and demand is real. If you build twice as much wind and solar, at least on the average day, you can get where you need to go, but that doesn't address your once every so often week-long shortfall. Our analysis is that geological storage of hydrogen is the cheapest way to store it. It can be stored in depleted oil and gas reservoirs or salt caverns, both of those. So these results here now are showing results from our resource planning tool in the state. And it basically says that if I can provide hydrogen below $3 a kilogram injected onto the natural gas grid or some other geological storage system that has access to renewables, you start to use it in the extreme case of $1 hydrogen, you would forego 27 roughly gigawatts of storage in favor of using hydrogen as a firm renewable fuel. Okay, so let's see, what can I do with a minute left? You know, my pre-recorded one was exactly 30 minutes.
No worries. We have 10 minutes.
Okay, so
buffer, so
the aggregate demand for hydrogen could be as high. Okay, so knitting all this together, we project up to 4.2 billion kilograms of hydrogen demand in California by 2050, meaning, sorry, renewable hydrogen, so not the same. Some of these things could be even more if we consider import-export, which we didn't, so you could have an ammonia export hub, things like that. But anyway, going from nothing to $4.2 billion, 4.2 billion kilograms, it's pretty daunting. So we developed some scenarios for effectively market shares to serve that demand. In this case, not based on rigorous comparative economics, but more qualitatively looking at the competitiveness of the fuels just because of the scope and really within the bounds of uncertainty, all these technologies can be competitive in certain circumstances, depending on carbon price and other factors. So this tells us that in our scenarios, no single technology will win in like the solution. So this would be typical of the scenarios that we've developed in terms of the quantity of new production capacity needed. The bars are individual annual capacity additions on this axis, and the yellow is the aggregate growth in capacity on this axis. So basically, the bottom is the anaerobic digestion. That's generally policy and mandate driven, we think. And then electrolyzers and gasifiers compete on cost. Initially, gasifiers are more cost competitive, as we showed, but later on, they are about equal, and eventually biomass supply constraints come into the picture, and electrolyzers have the stronger share. Depending on size, this means we need to build about 500 or odd facilities, something like that, for $50 to $75 billion, which seems a big number, but we spend $50 billion a year on petroleum today. So quickly to finalize, we did a siting analysis too to understand where these facilities might go and who they might impact. Feedstock proximity is very important. So this chart shows that the feedstocks are not evenly distributed, as you may imagine. Woody biomass is in the forest, and then we have ag waste, wind and solar resource areas, or solar in particular, is in the flat desert. Demand proximity is important also, less so than proximity to feedstock. At the end of the day, it turns out it's expensive to move these feedstocks. So we looked at different geospatial layers for access to needed infrastructure, electric system, gas system, road and rail. We also looked at the air basins, so this issue of not putting polluting resources in the already polluted areas, and we looked at disadvantaged communities. We wanted to do a pretty systematic analysis of disadvantaged community impacts and how that would impact siting. We scratched the surface, but realized we need to look at that much more fully in the future to say, hey, how would you weigh green jobs against noise, pollution, and traffic? So this is an example of what our build out scenarios look like. You know, you start with 15-ish facilities in 2025, and you have more than you can count by 2050. This is a daunting build out in any kind of infrastructure facility development, but we've experienced in the wind and solar markets that this type of build out is possible. So what are our recommendations? One, we do need to establish a cross-sectoral and multi-agency strategy. The banner strategy for climate in California is called the AB32 Scoping Plan, and people supporting hydrogen as a solution would like to see that very well reflected in the next update to that, which is in 2021. So as I mentioned, the state's support for renewable hydrogen has mostly focused on refueling stations. I think we and they know that it has to now begin to focus on the production end as well. In determining, you know, states handing out certain amounts of money, one of our recommendations is it should be done in a way that attracts private capital. So like loan guarantee programs might be more effective than just pure grants. Electric rate structures generally discourage electrolyzers where actually they're a very, very good coincident load. Incentive awards should promote new entrants to the market. As most young markets, we have a pretty thin and not very deep market. We need to understand better how local communities view the impacts of these facilities. And finally, we need continued R&D support focused on cost reduction, but also commercial pilots, which ties back to this comment on financing. These commercial pilots will help build an operating history date and allow lenders to assess risk in such a way that they could actually lend to future projects. And I guess I'm a little over.
Jeffrey, thank you very much. I think we got some great reaction on the chat about this. I think there's really one question, one sort of burning question about that really stands out about aviation and hydrogen. What would like a hydrogen powered aircraft look like? And why are people so skeptical about it? And how can we make them not skeptical about it?
So, you would have to store the fuel on board, probably as a liquid. So you need cryogenic storage tanks. You're not quite as energy dense even as a liquid as you are with conventional aviation fuel. Your propulsion system itself would probably, it could be a hydrogen turbine. There's very active development for land-based hydrogen turbines where people are more thinking about this power to gas to power. So you could run that. And then, people look at fuel cell as a drive, maybe more for the peripherals and the electric loads on board, but you could do an electric drive propeller system, which would make kind of a turboprop thing. Yeah. But I'm not deep in that area, although I'm organizer for an upcoming conference where we will have a presentation on that from a professor at Washington State. I just like to comment though, now that I remind myself, we at UC Irvine are hosting a conference specifically on the topic of hydrogen as a platform for sustainability, September 14 to 16. It's called ICEPAG, ice like ice, PAG, ICEPAG. So if you're interested, please join us.
Cool, thank you very much. We've actually got a few more minutes for questions as well. I think we were all very impressed by just the level of detail in this study. And something that really struck me was this sort of expert elicitation methodology that you have. And it struck me as a really good way of sort of cutting through BS. And I was wondering if you could elaborate on that a little bit.
So the expert elicitations that we used in this work were developed by other researchers, but we found them to be a very useful part. As I said, our forecasting was mostly based on extensive secondary research and then on our own learning rate analysis. But those have to do, so these more formalized methods are based on rigorous scientific research of the order. It's like survey science in a way. The order in which you ask the questions matters. The number of people you engage in one of these studies matters. What or if they interact with each other, So you might say, first, we're going to talk to you individually, and, they order the questions in a way that seeks not to influence the answers. Then maybe you get the group together at the end to like debate and see if that changes their perspectives.
Oh, that's fascinating.
But so in the most extensive study, they had 10. It was a formalized methodology in terms of the questions and the format. They had 10 experts, 5 academic and 5 industry.
Gosh, that's fascinating. Gosh, maybe it's time. So I'd just like to thank you again. I thought that was fantastic.